My name is Dan, and I'm 40. My wife, Heather, is 37. We've been married for 15 years and have 2 kids, Emma, 12, and Tyler, 9. To everyone on the outside, we looked like the quintessential family. Nice house, family vacations, holiday cards with matching outfits. But under the surface, things weren't as picture-perfect as they seemed. Heather and I met in college. She was this sharp, confident woman who knew what she wanted, and I fell for her hard. Over the years, though, that confidence turned into something else. Selfishness, maybe, or entitlement. She always had to be the center of attention, and she never took responsibility when things went wrong. Still, I loved her, and I was willing to overlook a lot for the sake of our family. About 6 months ago, things started to feel off. Heather became more distant, snappier than usual, and started spending more time out of the house. She'd claim she was going to the gym or running errands, but she'd be gone for hours. When I asked her about it, she'd roll her eyes and say I was being paranoid. Then there was her phone. She was suddenly glued to it, always texting or smiling at something on the screen. If I asked who she was talking to, she'd brush me off with a sarcastic, "Oh, relax, it's just the girls." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the sense that she was hiding something. At the same time, my sister, Lisa, had been acting strange too. Lisa and I have always been close, but recently, she'd been avoiding family gatherings and keeping her distance. It wasn't like her, and it added to the growing unease I was already feeling about Heather. Little did I know, these 2 threads, Heather's behavior and Lisa's secret, were about to collide in the most devastating way possible. The night I discovered the truth started like any other. Heather had gone out, claiming she was meeting her friends for drinks. I was home with the kids, helping them with homework and trying not to overthink her increasingly frequent nights out. After the kids went to bed, I decided to do something I'd never done before. Check her phone. I hated the idea, it felt invasive and wrong. But my gut was screaming at me that something was off. Her phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, and for once it wasn't locked. I hesitated, staring at the screen, but curiosity and desperation won out. The first thing I noticed was a string of messages to someone named Jake. At first, I assumed Jake was just one of her gym buddies or someone from work. But as I read through the texts, my heart sank. "I can't stop thinking about you. You make me feel alive in a way Dan never could. Let's meet up again soon. Same place." The messages weren't just flirty. They were explicit. And then came the photo, a selfie of Jake. He looked young, really young. My stomach churned as I stared at his face, trying to place him. He looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't figure out why. I kept scrolling, and that's when I found the answer. One of the messages mentioned a name that hit me like a freight train. Lisa. What if Lisa finds out? This could ruin everything.
Lisa.
My sister. Panic set in as I tried to connect the dots. Why was Heather mentioning Lisa in her texts with this kid? And why did Jake look so familiar? My mind was racing, but one horrifying possibility began to take shape. Jake wasn't just some random teenager. He was Lisa's son, her illegitimate child from when she was 18. She'd given him up for adoption, but he'd recently come back into her life after tracking her down. I'd only met him a handful of times, but now it all made sense. The secrecy, the odd behavior from both Heather and Lisa, the look on Jake's face in that photo. Heather wasn't just having an affair. She was having an affair with a teenager, my nephew. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My legs went weak, and I had to sit down to keep from collapsing. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding, trying to process what I'd just uncovered. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a nightmare. The next morning, I couldn't look at Heather without feeling a wave of nausea. She waltzed into the kitchen like everything was normal, pouring herself a cup of coffee and humming to herself. It was infuriating. "Sleep okay?" she asked, glancing at me over the rim of her mug. I didn't answer. Instead, I slid her phone across the table toward her, open to the messages with Jake. Her carefree expression evaporated in an instant. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice low and trembling. Her eyes darted to the screen, then back to me. For a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. But then, in true Heather fashion, she snapped into defensive mode. Why were you going through my phone? She snapped, her voice sharp. That's private. Private. I shot back, my anger bubbling to the surface. You're cheating on me, Heather. With a teenager. My nephew. Don't you dare try to make this about me. Her face turned pale, but she tried to regain control. It's not what you think, Dan, she said quickly. Jake and it's complicated. Complicated. I practically shouted. He's a kid. What the hell is wrong with you? She crossed her arms, glaring at me. He's not a kid. He's 19. And don't act like you're some perfect husband, Dan. You've been emotionally checked out for years. Maybe if you'd paid more attention to me, I wouldn't have needed someone else to make me feel wanted. Her words hit me like a slap to the face. Are you seriously blaming me for this? You're sleeping with my sister's son, Heather. There's no excuse for that. She rolled her eyes, as if I was overreacting. Jake is an adult. We're both consenting adults, Dan. Stop being so dramatic. The sheer audacity of her response made my blood boil. Consenting adults? He's family, Heather. Do you even hear yourself? Do you realize what this will do to Lisa? To the kids? Or do you only care about what you want? She looked away, refusing to answer. That silence was all I needed to confirm what I already knew. Heather didn't care about anyone but herself. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. You're going to end this. Now, you're going to tell Jake it's over, and you're going to stay the hell away from him. If you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done. Her head snapped back toward me, her eyes narrowing. You wouldn't. Try me, I said coldly. You've already destroyed our marriage, Heather. Don't make me destroy you. She didn't respond. She just grabbed her phone and stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind her. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space where she'd been. The confrontation had done nothing to ease the pain or the fury coursing through me. If anything, it had made everything worse. I knew I had to tell Lisa, but the thought of that conversation made my stomach churn. How was I supposed to break this to her without destroying her? 2. I spent the rest of the day trying to figure out how to approach Lisa. I replayed a dozen different versions of the conversation in my head, but none of them felt right. How do you even begin to tell your sister that your wife is sleeping with her son? That evening, I called Lisa and asked if I could come over. She sounded surprised. It wasn't like me to drop by unannounced. But she agreed. When I got to her house, she greeted me with a smile, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. What's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost, she said, leading me to the living room. I sat down, my hands clasped tightly together. Lisa, I need to tell you something, and it's bad. Really bad. Her smile faltered. What is it? Are the kids okay? Is it Mom? No, it's not that, I said quickly. It's about Jake. Her brow furrowed. Jake? What about him? I took a deep breath, bracing myself. Heather's been having an affair with him. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Lisa stared at me, her face a mix of confusion and disbelief. What? She said, her voice barely above a whisper. She's been seeing him. For months, apparently. I found out last night, I said, my voice cracking. Lisa blinked rapidly, as if trying to process what I just said. No, that's not possible. Jake wouldn't. Heather wouldn't. I pulled out my phone and showed her the screenshots I'd taken of their messages. Her face crumpled as she read them, her hands trembling. Oh my God, she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. How could he do this? How could she do this? I didn't know what to say. Lisa and Heather had always been friendly, even close at times. This betrayal cut both of us deeply, in ways I hadn't fully realized until that moment. Lisa suddenly stood up, pacing the room with her hands on her head. I knew Jake was struggling, she said, her voice shaking. He's been so lost, trying to figure out where he fits in after reconnecting with me. But this? I never thought he'd. She trailed off, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry, Lisa, I said, my own eyes burning. I don't know how this happened, but I had to tell you. You deserved to know. She stopped pacing and looked at me, her face hardened by anger and pain. I need to talk to him, right now. Are you sure? Maybe you should take some time. No, she said firmly. He needs to explain himself. And Heather? She's dead to me. I don't care what excuses she has. She's dead to me. I nodded, feeling a grim sense of solidarity with her anger. We were both victims of Heather's selfishness, and now we had to pick up the pieces of our shattered lives. As I left Lisa's house, I couldn't shake the image of her broken expression. Heather's betrayal hadn't just destroyed our marriage, it had torn apart my family, and the fallout was only just beginning. The next day, Lisa called me, her voice shaky but determined. I talked to Jake, she said. He admitted everything. I felt a lump rise in my throat. What did he say? Lisa took a deep breath. He said it started a few months ago. Heather reached out to him, claiming she wanted to help him adjust to being part of the family. At first, it was just texting, but it escalated. He said she made him feel special, like someone finally saw him for who he was. I clenched my jaw, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the phone. He's a kid, Lisa. She took advantage of him. I know, Lisa said, her voice breaking. He's young and stupid, and he got caught up in something he didn't understand. But Dan, he's not innocent in this. He knew what he was doing was wrong, and he did it anyway. Her words hit me hard. I wanted to pin all the blame on Heather, to make her the villain in this nightmare. But Jake wasn't a victim, not entirely. I need to talk to him, I said. Lisa hesitated. Are you sure that's a good idea? Things are already so messy. I'm sure, I said firmly. He needs to hear it from me, too. Later that evening, I met Jake at a nearby park. He looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot as I approached. He was just a kid, really tall and lanky, with a mop of dark hair that made him look younger than his 19 years. Hi, Uncle Dan, he said, his voice barely audible. Jake, I said, my tone sharp. You and I need to have a serious talk. He nodded, swallowing hard. I know.
I'm sorry.
Sorry doesn't cut it, I said, stepping closer. Do you have any idea what you've done? You didn't just screw up my marriage, Jake. You've torn this family apart. He looked down at his feet, his shoulders slumping. I didn't mean for it to happen, I swear. It just did. That's not good enough, I said, my anger boiling over. You're old enough to know better. She's a married woman. She's my wife. How could you even think this was okay? Jake's face crumpled, and for a moment, he looked like he might cry. She made me feel important, he said quietly. I didn't feel like I belonged anywhere, and then she gave me attention. She said she understood me. I let out a bitter laugh. Attention? You let yourself be manipulated by someone who was using you to stroke her ego. You think that's love, Jake? That's not love. That's selfishness. He nodded, tears streaming down his face now. I know I messed up. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. There's no making this right, I said coldly. But if you really care about this family, you'll stay away from Heather. Forever. Do you understand me? Yes, he whispered. I promise. I turned to leave, my heart heavy but resolute. Jake was young and maybe he'd learn from this. But I couldn't forgive him, not yet. Not while the wounds were still so fresh. As I walked away, I felt a strange mix of anger and pity. Jake was a product of his circumstances, but he'd made his choices. And now, like the rest of us, he'd have to live with the fallout. After confronting Jake, I went home feeling like I'd been through an emotional war zone. I was exhausted, angry, and more confused than ever. Heather was waiting for me in the living room, her arms crossed, a defensive look already plastered on her face. How'd it go? She asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. I stopped in my tracks, glaring at her. How do you think it went, Heather? I just had to lecture a 19-year-old kid about how wrong it is to sleep with my wife. So yeah, it went great. She rolled her eyes and sighed. I knew you'd make this bigger than it needs to be. Bigger than it needs to be? I repeated, incredulous. Do you even hear yourself? You've destroyed this family, Heather. And for what? A fling with a teenager who barely knows who he is. She threw her hands up in frustration. I'm not the only one to blame here, Dan. Don't act like our marriage was perfect before this. You've been distant for years. You work late. You never listen to me. I cut her off, my voice rising. Stop trying to justify this. Nothing I've done excuses what you did. You betrayed me, Heather. You betrayed our kids, our family, everything. For the first time, she looked genuinely shaken. I know, she said quietly. I know I messed up. I wasn't thinking. I felt so alone, Dan. Her words stung, but I refused to let her turn this around on me. If you felt alone, you could have talked to me. You could have told me how you were feeling. Instead, you chose to lie and cheat. She started crying, but I wasn't moved. I'd seen this act too many times before. The tears, the apologies, the promises to do better. It always led back to the same place. Her doing whatever she wanted, no matter who it hurt. I don't know if I can come back from this, I said, my voice trembling. You've destroyed every ounce of trust one had in you. And you didn't just hurt me. You hurt Lisa, the kids, everyone. Heather looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, Dan. Please, don't throw away everything we've built. I shook my head, my heart breaking all over again. You threw it away the moment you let this happen. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sobbing on the couch. For the first time in our marriage, I felt nothing but cold indifference toward her pain. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. My mind raced with questions. Could I ever forgive her? Should I try to keep the family together for the kids? Or was it time to end this chapter of my life and move on? The one thing I knew for sure was that things could never go back to the way they were. Heather had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the life we'd built together was crumbling beneath my feet. The hardest part of the entire ordeal was figuring out how to explain things to Emma and Tyler. They're just kids. They don't deserve to have their world turned upside down because of Heather's choices. For days, I avoided the conversation. I wanted to shield them from the ugliness of it all, to pretend that everything was fine for as long as possible. But kids are perceptive. Emma, especially, had started asking questions. Why are you sleeping in the guest room, Dad? She asked one night as I tucked her into bed. Her big, innocent eyes stared up at me, and it broke my heart. I sat on the edge of her bed, taking a deep breath. Sometimes moms and dads go through hard times, I said carefully. But I want you to know that no matter what happens, your mom and I both love you and Tyler very much. Are you and Mom getting a divorce? She asked bluntly. Her question hit me like a punch to the gut. I don't know yet, I admitted. But whatever happens, we'll always be here for you. Okay? That's never going to change. Emma nodded, but I could tell she wasn't satisfied with my answer. I kissed her forehead and told her to get some sleep, but I left her room feeling like I'd failed her. The next day, I sat down with Heather to talk about how we were going to handle things with the kids. It was one of the most civil conversations we'd had since the confrontation. We need to be honest with them, I said. Not about everything, but enough so they understand what's going on. Heather sighed, running a hand through her hair. I don't want them to hate me, Dan. This isn't about you, I snapped. This is about making sure they feel safe and loved. They don't need every detail, but they deserve to know the truth. In the end, we agreed to sit them down together. It was awkward and painful, but we kept it simple. We told them that Mom and Dad were going through a rough time and that things might change, but that we both loved them and were committed to making sure they were okay. Emma cried, and Tyler just sat there, looking confused. It was gut-wrenching, but I reminded myself that they were resilient and that, in time, they'd adjust. After the talk, Heather tried to hug me, but I pulled away. We're doing this for them, I said coldly. Don't read into it. She looked hurt, But I didn't care. My priority was the kids, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate me with guilt or tears. As the days went on, I threw myself into being the best dad I could be. I took the kids to the park, helped them with their school projects, and tried to create some sense of normalcy in their lives. It wasn't easy, but it gave me a sense of purpose and kept me from drowning in my own anger and sadness. Heather, meanwhile, seemed to retreat into herself. She stayed in the background, doing what she could to avoid confrontation. Part of me wondered if she was finally starting to feel the weight of what she'd done. But I couldn't bring myself to care anymore. My focus was on the kids, and on figuring out what kind of life I wanted for us moving forward. The weeks following our talk with the kids were some of the most emotionally taxing of my life. Every day, I found myself replaying everything in my head, trying to decide what to do. Should I stay and try to salvage the marriage for the sake of the kids? Or should I walk away and start fresh? Heather tried her best to mend things. She started seeing a therapist and suggested couples counseling, but I wasn't ready. You should focus on figuring yourself out first, I told her. Then maybe we can talk about us. The truth was, I didn't know if I even wanted there to be an us anymore. The trust was gone, and without it, our marriage felt hollow. One night, as I was scrolling through the photos on my phone, I came across an old family picture. It was from a trip to the beach a few years ago. We looked so happy. Heather and I holding hands, the kids grinning with ice cream cones in their hands. It hit me like a ton of bricks. That life was gone. The next morning, I called my attorney. I want to file, I said. Filing for divorce felt like ripping off a Band-Aid. It hurt, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. I knew it was the right decision, even if it wasn't an easy one. When I told Heather, she didn't seem surprised. She cried, of course, and begged me to reconsider. But there was a resignation in her voice that told me she knew this was coming. Dan, please, she said, her voice trembling. I know I messed up, but we've been through so much together. Doesn't that count for anything? It counts for a lot, I said, my voice steady. But it doesn't erase what you did. I can't stay in a marriage where I'm constantly wondering if I can trust you. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'll do whatever it takes to make this easier for the kids. I hope you mean that, I said, because they're the only reason I'm even willing to have this conversation with you. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, lawyers, and difficult conversations. Heather moved into a small apartment nearby, and we agreed on a custody arrangement that prioritized the kids' stability. I kept the house, partly for the kids' sake and partly because I couldn't stand the thought of starting over completely. The kids struggled with the change, especially Emma. She was old enough to understand that things would never go back to the way they were, and it broke my heart to see her so sad. But I kept reminding myself that this was the best thing for all of us in the long run. Heather and I were civil, even friendly at times, but the distance between us was palpable. I think we both knew there was no coming back from this, and honestly, I didn't want to. I was ready to close this chapter of my life and move forward. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. The day I signed the papers, I felt a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, even a strange sense of pride for having the strength to walk away from something so toxic. Heather and I kept things civil for the kids, but I set clear boundaries. She wasn't allowed to come into the house unannounced, and our conversations were limited to co-parenting topics. She seemed to respect that, though I could tell it hurt her. Jake thankfully stayed out of the picture. Lisa had cut contact with him after their confrontation, and as far as I knew, Heather had done the same. I didn't ask for details. It was better for my sanity to keep that door firmly closed. Life as a single dad was an adjustment. There were days when I felt overwhelmed, like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. But there were also moments of joy. Seeing Emma smile again, hearing Tyler laugh at one of my stupid jokes. That reminded me I was doing the right thing. I also started focusing on myself for the first time in years. I joined a gym, reconnected with old friends, and even started seeing a therapist. Talking to someone about everything I'd been through was cathartic, and it helped me unpack the anger and resentment I'd been carrying. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I found myself scrolling through a dating app. I wasn't sure if I was ready to put myself out there again, but the idea of starting fresh was appealing. I matched with a woman named Rachel, a teacher in her early 40s with a warm smile and a great sense of humor. We started chatting, and before I knew it, I was laughing at her jokes and feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was a slow process, but I started to feel like myself again. For so long, my identity had been tied to my role as Heather's husband and the father of her children. Now, I was discovering who I was outside of that relationship. Heather, meanwhile, seemed to be struggling. She tried to maintain the image of a strong, independent woman, but I could see through it. She'd lost the respect of many of our mutual friends, and her relationship with Lisa was still fractured. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, but I couldn't. She'd made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt optimistic. The pain of Heather's betrayal would always be a part of my story, but it didn't have to define me. I had my kids, my friends, and a second chance at happiness, and I wasn't going to waste it. It's been a year since the divorce, and life looks a lot different now. There are still tough days. Co-parenting with Heather isn't always smooth, and there are moments when the betrayal creeps back into my mind like an old wound reopening. But those moments are fewer and farther between now. The kids are doing better, too. Emma has adjusted to the new normal and even seems to appreciate the stability I've worked hard to create. Tyler's resilience amazes me. He's happy and carefree, just like a kid his age should be. Knowing they're thriving despite everything has made all the struggles worth it. Heather and I maintain a distant but cordial relationship for the kids' sake. She's apologized a few times since the divorce, but I've never given her the closure she's looking for. I think she finally understands that some things can't be undone, no matter how sorry you are. As for me, I'm in a much better place. Therapy has helped me process everything, and my relationship with Rachel has grown into something meaningful. She's kind, funny, and empathetic. Everything I didn't realize I was missing. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much my life has changed. When I first found out about Heather's affair, I thought it would destroy me, and for a while it did. But what I've learned is that betrayal doesn't have to be the end. It can be a beginning, a painful, messy beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. If I could give advice to anyone going through something similar, it would be this. Trust your instincts, don't be afraid to confront the truth, and prioritize your own well-being. You can't control what someone else does, but you can control how you respond to it. Heather's choices may have shattered the life we built together, but they didn't break me. In fact, they forced me to grow, to reassess what really matters, and to start building a better future for myself and my kids. If you're reading this and you're in the middle of your own storm, just know that it does get better. It's not easy and it's not quick, but it does get better. You're stronger than you think, and you deserve a life filled with love, respect, and trust. As for Heather, I don't know what her future holds, and honestly, I don't care. She made her choices and I've made mine. The only thing that matters now is moving forward, and I'm finally ready to do just that. Thank you for staying with me. This crazy journey is finally over and I'm ready for what's next. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more interesting stories. And leave a comment with what you would do in this situation. See you in the next videos.